Perfect.
Okay, good. Well, then
I hit continue on the record here.
Yeah, you just have to. And I can send you a copy as well.
I got to close other things off, actually.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm going to get interrupted by Slack and everything.
Oh, right, yeah. The dreaded. Just another way for it to take all of our attention. So many of these
relentless. Okay, there we go. All right, email's closed, Slack is closed. Calendar, sorry, not closed calendar, and yeah, good, excellent. Okay, we're good.
Fantastic. Okay, well, Dr. Raven Bowen, welcome to the Bliss of the Abyss.
Hi, happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, no, thank you for having me. It's Canada Day. It's 6 a.m. But you told me that you're still on UK time, so perhaps you're going to be more awake than I would be at 6 a.m. That's for sure.
Yes, I'm alert.
You're alert. Have you got anything planned for Canada Day?
No, actually, I'm working, and then I think I'll melt into the couch because there's a heat wave going on here, and chocolate melts. So I think I'll just slide off of the couch. I'm actually watching Better Call Saul. I'm binging it. I never did finish that series, so that's what I'm.
Yeah, I never did either. I was obsessed with Breaking Bad, and then I let the ball drop. Then it ended, and you needed more. Give me more.
Yeah, give me more.
I don't blame you. So, I mean, I'll give you an introduction at the beginning and stuff. But for people who are unaware, would you like to sort of introduce yourself and your work? Your most recent book is called Work, Money and Duality: Trading Sex as a Side Hustle.
Yes. So let's see. I've done a lot of community organizing with sex workers, mostly in Canada. And then later on, around 2015, I started in the UK. So I was on the board of ScotPep and did some work with workers there. Was also doing my PhD alongside. So I started the PhD in Durham, ended it in York, and I was focusing on people who blend sex work and square work, which is what I'm calling duality. Currently, I'm the CEO of National Ugly Mugs, which is a UK charity that supports sex workers and people in adult industries who become victims of crime. So I've had multiple identities over the last probably 30 years working on these issues. But yeah, I landed with just focusing. I went back to academics mid-career because there are just so many gaps in between what I know and see happening in the community and how people are innovating and what's in the literature or what turns out to be how policy or legislation is created. So there's so many missteps between lived experience and how that's manifesting and how we're responding to people engaged in sex work.
And legislating it or failing to properly, perhaps.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so you spoke to, how many people did you speak to for this book? There's a ton of quotes. It's really interesting. There's so much direct reportage of people's experience. Some of them are very fascinating. It's like a window into a world a lot of us don't normally get.
Absolutely. And because it was a PhD study, I contained it to 35, but there were 25 in the UK sample. And some of those interviews were 5 hours long. It was very, very in depth, and it's a qualitative study. So I wanted the book to have their voices come through really clearly, because you won't hear from these people. They're not going to be the people you see when you think about or talk to necessarily sex workers. So I wanted to make a lot of space for to bring understanding to why they do what they do and how similar they are to all of the rest of us, and the way that they're strategizing and what underpins all of that. So yeah, I made a lot of room for them to speak in the book.
Yeah, and we're definitely going to get into all of it. I've got tons of things I'm interested to ask you about, because really, I full disclosure, by the way, we met through work. I voiced some characters in your book.
You sure did.
Which was amazing, fun experience, and really interesting inhabiting those characters. And so I'm kind of here as and not particularly educated in the subject, except for having read your book, and I'm sure my audience also won't be particularly knowledgeable on this. We all know our bits and pieces, but so you're really here just to tell us all of these amazing things that you've learned from these people who live this dual life, what it's like for them, and what their experiences are, the troubles that they face, both, you know, internally and societally. And yeah, there's a few bits of language that I'm still trying to get used to, so if I get it wrong, excuse me. But
Oh, no
so
worries.
square work is, as I understand it, like an office job, or like regular fits in the box.
Yeah, straight
work.
mainstream, and that is a terminology that is more North American. There, you know, some people call it in the UK, they call it their civvy job.
Civvy.
Some call it their normal job, which, you know, or their straight job, or things like that. But yeah, it is that non-sexualized labor. But, you know, a lot of labor, square labor, is sexualized anyway. But it, you know, the way that we're defining it is like delivering or providing services, delivering services, distinctly adult services. That, so one would be firmly in that broad adult industry, and one is more, you know, I work at Greg's kind of thing. So,
isn't that so interesting what you said about, you know, we call it like square, but like it utilizes, it plays on our sexual desires and our unconscious and conscious desires. All marketing is always sex sells, etc. And you could have, you know, it just occurs to me, you could have like a square job working at like a big porn production house or something. And it's like but that's square work according to like these imagined things, but like they're not imagined. Then you walk into a bank, folks, and there are real life consequences, aren't there?
Totally. And that's like, I think what I've also learned, I gotta plug in my computer, sorry. What I've also learned about this, and how I've sort of conceptualized sex work and square work, future research, I wouldn't necessarily do that in the ways that I have, because, you know, as you say, there's lots of square occupations and square jobs in sex industries, and sexualized jobs in the square world or the mainstream market. But I would totally make the differentiation between the work that we hide and the work that we reveal. And so I think that, and I would want to do obviously a much broader study, but that would be some of the same ways that folks in the book are hiding their sex work or managing their audiences and information, is the same way we would if we were hiding that we were, I don't know, delivering food on the side of our other job, like, you know, those same things. And it would just pull this population of sex workers into the working class a bit more. And yeah, so it was, there's a lot of fluidity between sex work and square work, and I'd like to explore that more, but I created that the continuum, and just to delve in specifically with how people are blending sex work and square work, because there's absence in the literature and absence in our thinking and theorizing around sex work and work, about these folks who really challenge some of the narratives there. Yeah,
definitely. I mean, and you know, you're speaking for a group of people that have been, like, some of the terms in the one that stuck out to me was that sex workers were described as lumpen proletariat. These just derogatory things they've been called throughout the ages. And I remember, I was reading your book, I remember actually a personal experience I had, because I'm an actor by training, right? And I was in a cemetery in, I think it's Nunhead, but I can't remember. It's kind of a gorgeous cemetery, and they had this plaque sort of describing where people were buried, and, you know, there was a royal area, and it was like actors were not allowed to be buried on this ground until so and so, and then they were only allowed a corner because they were seen as profane. And in a weird, and they share that kind of thing with people who've been sort of maligned. I'm sure prostitutes weren't allowed to be buried.
Women in theater, actors were considered sex workers and prostitutes.
Yep, exactly. That's right. And I think it's even like Molière was not going to be buried. And like, this is like France's greatest playwright without the intervention of the king, because it's like, no, they're selling something, which is a strange bias that human societies seem to develop. I mean, maybe you can explain that a bit to me. Why does it seem pervasive, do you think, across human societies, that we do develop these biases against certain professions?
Yeah, I think that there is a tendency to want to vilify a population, you know, that whole folk devil, like something goes wrong and it's the witches, or it's the women, or it's the immigrants, or it's like, we want to point to a population or a tangible thing that we can blame for everything and to scapegoat for everything. So I think throughout history, different populations have experienced the brunt of that, some more than others. You know, we'd focus on gay people and trans people and, you know, Black people and Chinese, like, and, you know, even the narrative during COVID, right? Some of the narrative from some of the North Americans, he who shall not be named, you know, would just name the virus after a group of people. Like, so I think that there is that tendency to vilify and other people so that we can hold them responsible for everything that happens wrong in our society.
Is it something sort of built into the fabric of what being a human being is, or is that, do you think, like a byproduct?
I think it's a choice.
Yeah,
I think we choose it, because, you know, I'm all about us being responsible for the environments that we create and being responsible for the conditions that we create for each other. And it isn't something that can be, you know, like reified or externalized. It's we do this to each other and we choose it. Like stigma, we choose to stigmatize people.
It's true.
It's an absolute choice.
I mean, and even within the sex work world, there's a term I learned from your book, I'm not going to pronounce it correct, hierarchy.
Hierarchy, yeah.
So like, even within the sex worker world, my point is people are stratifying themselves into, I am worth more than you, or of a different, and I can point the finger at you for X, Y, and Z.
Yeah. And that thing about, I think I cited a theorist who talked about downward comparisons. Like people do that all the time when they feel they need to set themselves above someone else for whatever reasons. And we tend to do that because we're quite competitive as human beings, I guess. But to elevate yourself and to point at somebody else as being lower or worse, that happens throughout our society. And we see that in sex work, but that's just reflecting how we do that in mainstream anyway. But some of the things and some of the things that kind of affect your status in sex industries include like police attention, or how discreet you could be, or race, class, and gender, or, you know, all those kinds of things that also we see that mirrored in mainstream workforces, and, you know, whose labor we pay more for and whose we don't, and who we value and who we don't.
So for my listeners, can you just explain what a hierarchy is? I still think I'm pronouncing it wrong.
No, you are. Hierarchy, that's fine. You're not pronouncing it wrong. Absolutely not. And it is the way the sex industry is stratified, so that some people who are involved in some aspects in the industry that resemble dating, sugaring, cammers who don't have direct contact with clients. There's divisions between on and off street workers. There's divisions between locations of work, how you work, where you work. So there's a lot of things that influence your power and status, who can command the most money, who is able to market and benefit the most from the industry, or it's the same sort of standards of beauty that we have both in and outside of the industry. It's the same people who, you know, we celebrate as models and as our ideal body types, etc., are the same ones that will do very well in sex industries, because client preferences is based on societal preferences. Agents and other third parties will promote certain forms of beauty, and they'll promote what's most marketable, right? So it's a mixture between having a hierarchy of human beings based on characteristics and traits, but also, even if you're considered, like you would say at times, that workers of color or migrants or people who are non-white, or in this context non-UK, would occupy the bottom rungs, but then they are fetishized in ways that sometimes they can command higher prices. Some people play on the stereotypes of each culture so that they can command more money if they're able to work in ways that they can appeal to higher paying clients, and they can avoid police and that kind of thing. So there's a complete stratification in the sex industry that mirrors and is kind of grounded in what we value in mainstream society.
And what we see in culture at large, it's reflected in there. Wow. Yeah.
And no surprise, right? Because if you know, a person, a buyer, someone who's interested in purchasing sexual services is socialized in a culture that values green hair. So then when they're seeking company, they're going to look for someone who has green hair. Like it is that it is that way that, you know, we co-produce these ranks, this stratification. We co-produce the hierarchy.
So thinking about what people think in the general population about people who go and purchase these services, right? People who are buying sex off of people selling sex. I think maybe probably at large we view them as, if not either lonely, that's definitely one of them, but also potentially like a bad actor, someone with malintent who wants to hurt somebody. Because the sex worker is often in a vulnerable situation, be it if it's a really fancy hotel, they've got a bit more protection, but some of them it's a car. And so we view the people who buy the sex, I think, skeptically, because we've all read countless stories of these people being assaulted and sometimes killed. And so, sorry, go on.
Yeah, like I think we need to differentiate between people who buy sex and people who violate sex workers.
Right.
Right, because I run a charity that documents harms against people in adult industries, and harms include all kinds of things like rape and assault and harassment and non-payment and condom removal and all those things that are in violation of the contracting that sex workers do when they select and engage with a customer. Right. So customers, we should understand, right? And they're people who respect the terms and conditions of the engagement they have with industry folks. They pay and then they go home, right? That's great. We don't mind them. If there's regulation that's needed around that, fine. Let the adults in those various industries and engage face-to-face with customers decide what the rules of engagement will be. Let's support them in regulating that, right? But those who victimize and take advantage of sex workers because they have less access to police protection as you would, for example, or they're not necessarily seen as credible witnesses in court, or they're not believed for what's happening to them. Those are the individuals that we need to pursue, but we need to pursue them and also protect sex workers and their right to work in industries and their right to leave industries, but they have a right to be safe no matter what. So that differentiation, but there is a lot of judgment for people who buy sex and who consume sexuality, which is really weird because we have commercialized sexuality in every way possible in our society. And when corporations are selling jeans by showing, people taking them off, or sometimes you don't even see the jeans, like they're balled up in the corner and there's people on the bed, like you don't see the products, but corporations do it. But when individuals decide, I'm going to commercialize myself, I'm going to be a webcammer, I'm going to do dance, I'm going to do full contact sex work, I'm going to do massage. When people decide to do that for themselves, then we have this additional special judgment of them.
And do you think from all the people that you interviewed, was the majority of people that when they first forayed into sex work as a side hustle, how many of it was sort of forced, if you see what I mean? How many of them were, I am not going to make rent or food or whatever this month, I'm going to lose my house unless I come up with, let's say, 200 quid? And then
all of them experienced like force through poverty, through necessity. They had something to repay, they were paying tuition, they were paying their kids' tuition, they had a debt due, all of them had some degree of financial need, because I focused on people because there are people who enter industries that are exploration or curiosity or, more casual, but I focused on people who had an intent for their involvement and had this financial need that underpinned their reasons for doing the work, because that's the majority, most of the reason why anyone does any work, let alone sex industry work, right? And
I think so. I'd have to agree. Okay. So that's interesting. Because I mean, it makes you wonder sort of what percent, and I don't know if it's even helpful to put a number on it. It's just probably the way my brain works. It's like what percent are just dipping their toe and just curious, and also what percent sort of does it become their main hustle, but then they need to keep the square work there for the veneer of respectability, right? For the societal acceptance and the
paper trail.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, like, so I'm seeing it, and this is based also on my practitioner experience that spans quite a few, unfortunately, about 3 decades now.
Wow.
But you know,
3 decades. You look younger than me. What's going on?
Oh no, I'm kicking 50s door
Dr.
down
Bowen. No, you are not.
I am. My birthday's on Monday.
To the listener who's only hearing this, you would not believe that.
Oh, yeah, it's true.
Wow, congratulations.
Yeah, well, yeah, thank you. Well, I guess. Thank you. I don't look my age. That's great. Yeah, no, I've been at this probably about 27 years, 28 years, something like that. And so, like, the continuum talks about people who, it acknowledges people who do soul sex work and soul square work, but my focus was on how people are blending the two, right? So we see that a lot, and it was also a focus on off-street workers as well. So I would say between 30 and 45% of off-street industry workers are doing other things on the side to make money. And that's like, you know, the dancer who's putting herself through school and doing another job like that. It's just part of how it has to happen, right? And these folks are, they've incorporated sex work to supplement income, but most of the folks came from full-time square jobs. I think there was maybe 1, maybe 2 people in the sample that came from full-time sex work into living a dual life, but most of them came from the square world. So, and the ways that they were blending, they were either like blending sex work and square jobs to transition into a full-time square job or full-time sex work, so like a transition hustle, or they were blending in order to achieve some goal, like some project, like they're getting on the property ladder, paying something off, doing something, right? So they had an end date in mind. And then there were folks that were doing it and decided that I choose not to ever be poor. So they decided that they're always going to have, they're supplementing their income in sex industries or square work. They're going to decide how much of each they're doing, but they'll consistently blend that as a financial plan for their life. And so that meant social mobility. That meant, there's this one woman, her name's Joy, and she.
I pulled a quote from Joy that I particularly found fascinating. She said,
okay, sure.
I don't do sex work full time because I don't want to lose my identity of who I perceive myself to be.
Yeah. And that's the thing too, because I did talk to them about identity and, you know, which job they identified with, where they're drawing their sense of who they are from. And for her, it was definitely her square job, because you have to consider that in this book, there are people who were their education and their credentials would point them into a career trajectory where, you know, she landed in the career that she actually trained for.
Yeah.
But she wasn't able to get the kind of income that she needed in order to do the things she needed, like an example, paying for her child's tuition.
Yeah, which I think is another stereotype that your book challenged, I think, for some people, of the percentage of people who actually were university educated and still did enter into a duality work situation. It's and
people who live dual lives benefit. It's a terrible stereotype that we have, because the book definitely does open people's minds about who trade sex and why these folks should be considered as part of the working class, because they used to always be. But the stereotypes about sex workers not necessarily being educated, not necessarily being skilled, that kind of thing, like that is, I don't know, like some 1970s version of who trades sex. Like that is not the modern day. But because of stereotypes like that, people who live dual lives are able to conceal and able to hide in plain sight, because you would never suspect that they are trading sex.
Yeah, and obviously this resonated with me as someone who's played parts, but I've never led a dual life, and it must be exhausting. I mean, it's akin to, not that I'm saying morally these are the same things, but like bigamy, or someone who has another family or something like that. It's a whole other existence where you are a whole different you, and you have to be able to shift gears into one and then shift gears into the other and hope that the two worlds never collide in case one of them destroys the other, or both.
Absolutely. And I don't think I included in the book all the commentary about how some people were likening what they're doing to being a spy. because it is, you construct a whole reality. And some people were pretty well versed at that because they come from homes and grew up in ways that they would have to hide their home life from their school friends, or, you know, there are people who are kind of pretty well versed in being what the world needs them to be in a certain situation and then being something else. And but for others, it was like, it could be Jekyll and Hyde, right? And what's interesting with some of the folks, because some of their square jobs, like if you're in health services as your square job and you're doing sexual massage as your sex industry job, there's a lot of integrated skills and knowledge transfer and all that between the jobs, but you have to keep it separate because you lose your license to practice, you lose pretty much everything.
Right, you don't want to forget you're at your square work while you're doing
etc. And there's like some instances where, you know, there was that overlap or that leakage, but and people you'd risk everything, like, so you have to, even though one job may inform the other in ways that were beneficial for people, they had to keep those things separate, and any sort of accomplishments in certain jobs, they'd have to hide it and they couldn't claim it all. And it is that. So when you talk about your being an actor and moving in and out of roles, like you know that intimately about, you have to know things differently and be things differently and not give off or give away anything that would signal that your face doesn't match your words, you know.
Absolutely. And I mean, not to draw the analogy out, but I've seen actors who can't let it go and it bleeds over into their non-acting work, and it's damaging to them as well. But it's exhausting, as you said. And it's exhausting. And there's something you said in the book that for these people, being outed is their greatest fear. They lose everything because, you know, and they also hide their sex work from square people and their square work from sex industry folks too, because, you know, sometimes like it's having a degree isn't necessarily the best way to be mobile in sex industries like that. Those are kinds of things that they would need to suppress. But the way that we treat people who engage in sex industries it's appalling. It's hypocritical. It's disgusting. And we know why. We understand the fact that most people enter sex industries for money. Most people have limited choice. You know, we do have a very precarious labor market where we've made it so that, you know, you can barely find a full-time job. And but then we shouldn't be punishing folks because that, I mean, they haven't created the labor market situation, have they? Well, all of us have. But yes, they're absolutely as a group, but they're at the mercy as a group, but exactly, and they're getting the stanky end of everything. You know, and people trying to piece together jobs and trying to make ends meet. And we have had a decade of austerity and more in the UK, and they were like salary caps, and we watch people get wealthy. Look at how many billionaires we're creating during the pandemic. More millionaires and billionaires. Yes. Incredible, right? And then some people are just like, they're working their asses off. If you work a full-time job and you are like barely living above the poverty, like you get frustrated. And for these individuals, because they did most of them, like, you know, took the trouble to go to school, go to university, get the credentials you're supposed to get. They believe the whole lie that there'll be a job for them at the other end of it. And what we've done is we've really casualized and fragmented the labor market so that we have people who would normally find full-time employment struggling to make ends meet. But we've created that because, you know, we consume the goods of companies who don't pay their staff, and they've externalized like all the labor costs and the benefits. They've made it too easy, haven't they? Amazon is too good a product. It's too easy to click a thing on this device that's already, they've gamified the device to make you spend more time on it. And then you're in the program that they've gamified to hijack your reward system. And then you just click the one thing and it arrives at your door. And it's like, it's too good a system. So human beings are not going to give that up. We're just not. And that means that good jobs. That means that. But like everything else, it's not just delivery jobs and those kinds of jobs. It's jobs in academics, it's jobs in health services, it's jobs in education. Like all of these jobs become, okay, you've got a 10-month contract, but there's 12 months in a flipping year. Like, and we're supposed to like make ends meet that way. And so we're doing this to each other. We want the benefits of our
instant, fast consumerism, our society, but we have to then why brutalize and humiliate and criminalize sex workers then? Because they're just hustling and they're just doing what, they are. These folks are the mainstream workers that are delivering the coffee, that are doing all these things. But they're also doing this, and it's legal work as well. So why are we,
I think that's the
stigmatizing them?
That's the key question. That's kind of what I hoped you were going to be able to answer, because I think that is the main. It's like, okay, there are some places in the world where it has now been legalized in various forms, right? There are
or decriminalized,
or decriminalized as well. So it just depends where you're at. But like, it doesn't seem like those places have completely fallen apart once this has happened.
Everybody's not a sex worker in New Zealand or New South Wales.
Much akin to the way Canada just legalized marijuana in a stroke. And it's like, how's Canada doing? It's doing Canada.
It's great. And you know what?
Canada.
All the pot smokers are still pot smokers, and all the people who aren't pot smokers are still not pot smokers. Exactly. And all of this fear that's being, spewed around, it is that fear mongering that, oh my God, if you do this, the floodgates will open and everybody, will do this. And it's like, no, the people who are doing it will be safer. They'll have choice. They'll have access to police protection. They'll have, all kinds of flexibility. People who exploit and harm them, they'll construct those folks out. Like, you don't need a gangster around you if you've got legitimate, business,
state-backed protection by laws and rights,
and people who are already in those industries paying the taxes that we all use for all the, they're already paying for the public services, and they're paying for the paying taxes, and they're not benefiting from those services because we've decided to judge their work, even though it's legal work. It's hypocrisy.
Do you think it's a holdover from, like I said, the 19th century, the way they looked at things? This is, and they call it sort of the oldest profession in the world, let's use that cliche, but like, it's definitely feels to me like places where they've managed to destigmatize it. You ask me, I always think decriminalization is the answer anyway, but like, it just seems like that is obviously the answer, and the only reason it hasn't happened is some holdover, some moral, some taboo idea that we can't.
I would say it's moral, partially more like we haven't dealt with stigma fully, even in the places where sex work is just decriminalized, and we haven't dealt with really extending those rights to migrant workers and to workers of color. So they're even in New Zealand and New South Wales. But there is like this morality issue that we have to deal with. It's straight up hypocrisy. But also, and I missed what I was going to say, that people benefit from the way things are. Right? Like nothing that's happening is an accident, right? So why I chose relationalism as the theoretical approach is so that we don't see structure as something other than people doing things repeatedly, right? So if we decided that, the people who have the power to decide and to support sex workers in organizing their own industry aren't doing it, I think that there is, we have to think about who benefits from disorganization in sex industries. So when you hear people wanting to criminalize buying and do all these things and make sex workers more dependent on third parties and hide and be on the dark web and all this stuff, they are making sex workers dependent on third parties. And there are folks who benefit from unemployment and desperation among sex workers.
And who are those folks?
The people who benefit monetarily would be the people who manage industries, the people who have shares in some of these huge sites, the people who have shares in some of these companies, webcam companies, etc. There are, I think, business folks and really like corporate, I wouldn't say corporate, but people who are business savvy are not necessarily only doing square businesses, right? So we have to think, if we think about the sex industries mirror the square world, the people who are doing the best in the square world are the same kinds of folks who are doing the best in sex industries and in informal economies, because you can't run a business in an informal economy without being connected, without having resources, without having a way to protect yourself and shield yourself. Like these are big game players. And so I think that the folks who target sex workers, who want to see them criminalized, don't really understand that whole cause and effect, because otherwise we would empower and support sex workers in claiming taking back control of their work and their working conditions, their environment, and making sure that sex workers have power in negotiating their work, and we would never work to turn the sex industry into a buyer's market.
And then if it is those big business interests that are benefiting from it, then they also have the power to shape the narrative. Like, I don't know if
they would be able to either influence policymakers, or
exactly.
you know,
spread the message
like have
to the public.
some power, some soft power. There's something going on there, and I like my life, so I'm not gonna, you know, delve into like organized crime and all that stuff. And that's a hustle too, like, you know. So, you know, I just respect the hustle and stay in my lane about that stuff. But, you know, we have to explore who benefits from the way things are, and not just believe that it is the way it is because that's the way it is. It's like, we make it that way. And folks allow things to happen, turn a blind eye, maybe take some, you know, kickback money, whatever. Like, there's stuff going on. And I also think that sex workers have a lot of power, and they would have more, and that's scary for people.
Yeah, if there was legal and a union, that's what it needs. I mean, again, that's just my personal opinion. I just think that's what
they are unionizing, right? There's a United Voices of the World. Sex workers are unionizing, absolutely. And
in informal ways, which is better than nothing, of course.
Formal and informal ways, absolutely. And because, like, we haven't criminalized selling sex, or we haven't criminalized that. We haven't criminalized purchasing sex from a voluntary adult person who's consenting. You know, we haven't done that in the UK, which is it's a good thing. And we're still at the point where we can support folks to organize their industries in ways that work for them, that there's occupational health and safety guidelines and all those things, ways that make it safe for them to do so. Because this idea that we're going to eliminate the demand for sex, the demand for consuming adult content is that's not. I want a world that's kind of colorful and you know, that's
cute,
and
that
celebrating the
even
human.
Say that. There's just no way. I looked up when I was doing some of the research for this. I looked up, because I'm a bit of a nerd with words. It was like, where does the word pornography come from? And it's like from ancient Greek. Like this shit's been around, and it was for drawing naked women. That was the first ever porn, you know, in a rudimentary way. It's like, listen, it's not going anywhere.
All of the books, all of the porn, all the entertainment. And what's really gets at me, because, you know, hypocrisy just, I don't know, I think that's why I wake up in the morning, because I get angry and stuff. But it's that every time you see a true crime drama or a series of something about crime, it's always a sex worker being murdered, and there's such consumerism around that, right? Like, is this thing where it's like a guilty pleasure. I don't understand it. It's like, we you know, the ways that we've marketed and benefited off Jack the Ripper, and then Jack the Stripper, and then like all this stuff, like we've commercialized and benefited so much off of the misery and murder of sex workers. But yet when they come to us as mainstream folks asking for rights and recognition and options and protection, we don't provide it.
And this is a question I had for you, because I think in some people's minds, they'll think, well, this sex work is not a neutral act. Do you understand what I mean?
What does that mean?
I'm trying to sort of articulate this thought. It's like, I think a lot of people would not view it as a neutral act, as in it's charged, it's intimate. And I think some people might view it as it's a selling of a service. So it's no different from selling any other service. But I think there's a sizable percentage of people who think, well, I couldn't do it. Although they'd probably surprise themselves if the wolf came to the door and realized they
were starving. How long can you listen to a crying baby? Yeah,
absolutely. But I do think there's people who think that way. And I was trying to wonder about why. And that's where I thought maybe it's
because it's horse stigma. But neutral as in, I'm thinking that when you're
the effect that it has on a sex worker, on their psyche.
Right. Okay. So we're talking then, we're narrowing this sex industry to contact sex work.
Yes.
Where
Yeah,
they're right.
absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's an
Sorry.
absolute sliver. Okay.
Sorry.
Just
Should have been clear.
yeah,
Yeah.
sure. So there is that there are folks in the industry that provide full services, for example. So it provides full sexual services, full contact, all of that. So those are the people who I think most people think about when they're talking about the industry, but that's not the industry.
That's
But
not
just
the majority,
let's
because of the
follow your
internet,
thought.
which is what I wanted to come on to next, because the internet is such a fascinating topic. But
Yeah.
yeah, just for
But
the
just following your
in-person
thought
client,
that
yes.
because some people want to see sex as sacred, religious, within marriage or
Definitely.
something, assuming that marriage is some
Natural,
sacred, safe institution
yeah.
that women aren't brutalized,
Yes.
and men and other people aren't brutalized within.
Exactly.
So I think that it is that it's horse stigma, because what Gail Federson talked about when she talked about horse stigma is it's that selling your honor for base goods, or for a base, like for money, right? So people who see sex as something that's virtuous, if you're someone that then sells sexual services, they would see you as selling sex for base gain, which is immoral. So people who apply moralistic lenses, they did the same to homosexuality, right? Like
yes,
it's the same kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
Or interracial marriage, like same kind of thing. Like, so they're applying this moral authority to something that the individuals who are involved in selling and purchasing may not see it that way. Like and adults have the right to define their own work and their own circumstances. And sex workers are really good at making the distinction between what's work and what's not, what's intimate for them and what's not. So that's why sex workers negotiate those things and advertise what's available and what isn't. So if someone doesn't want to kiss, or doesn't want to do the girlfriend experience or the boyfriend experience, they say that in there, they communicate that, and they negotiate those terms between them and the parties that they're interacting with. So yeah, I can see that there are people who, particularly because if the seller of sex isn't controlling the transaction, and we have set it up so that that's usually the case for most workers who happen to be survival workers, or in desperate need of money, the buyer has more control, right? And so so that's why we need to lift people out of poverty, so that nobody's involved in survival work, so that the transactions that they negotiate are on even footing, or the sex worker, the expert, usually has more power in the situation, in most situations when we're buying and selling things. So we have to make sure that we're eliminating the conditions that lead to survival sex, which includes poverty. So that if you had, let's say, a guaranteed livable income, you wouldn't be necessarily selling sex for drugs or to make your rent, because you would be living above the poverty line, and you wouldn't have those needs, and you could be more selective about who you see and what you did and when you worked and whatever, and you have a lot of choice, and you can say no to a client. Because the definition of survival sex that I've worked under for the last 20 odd years has been that the inability or the lack of opportunity to turn down, to say no to work, to turn down the next client. So if we make it so people involved in industries have the opportunity to turn down the next client, then they're never desperate for that
and then
money in order to survive
from an unequal position, and potentially make desperate and bad decisions for their own well-being.
Yeah. And then maybe does that answer that question about what you were talking about feeling that there's
neutral? I think the way
transactions aren't neutral.
No.
Like commercial capitalism isn't neutral.
See, this is the way that I came to think about it. So tell me if you think I'm completely off with this. I'm like, okay, like I said, decriminalize it and regulate it and unionize. That is my default position. But I was thinking of the psyche of the person being affected, because I don't think sex is neutral. I think it has positives and negatives in different situations and different scenarios, but it's rarely neutral. I think probably some people can switch off and make it neutral. But I think for most of us, it probably has some pulls that are positive and some that are negative. But then I just thought, yeah, but like, imagine if I worked in a mortuary. Like, what would be some of the side effects on my psyche? I would definitely think about death a lot more.
You'd have a stigmatized job because it's a tainted job.
Yep, exactly. And
like being a grave digger.
And those are just the things that come with this area. And so I was thinking that might come with that area. It certainly would, I think, for me.
And the neutrality, I mean, yeah, like it's that affecting, lots of jobs affect our psyche.
Yeah.
And so, if you worked in a job you hated, cleaning public toilets in a fast food restaurant, a job that I've actually done in my life, there's probably every other job that I would rather do aside. And also the way that, like, the public treated you in that situation, the garbage people would leave, the things people would say, like, so these folks who live this dual life work in these sometimes crappy jobs in square work.
Yeah.
And then have experiences of working in sex industries where they're more entrepreneurial. These are off-street workers, so they're more entrepreneurial, and they find more liberation and freedom and control over their work and more, I guess, neutrality, if you want neutrality, in square industries, right? And vice versa. There are some people who, those of us who work in the square world, will find it more fulfilling than doing sex work. Like we all have come from it from a different place and interpret things differently. And the psyche and the emotional well-being of folks who are forced to do any work that you don't like, I think that we need, or don't want to do, I think that we need to, that's why I think we need to eliminate forced labor. But we have a capitalist society that depends upon your desperate need for work, so that I can force you to do crappy labor and underpay you and undervalue you, because that's the form of capitalism that we have chosen and that we choose to practice and repeat and rinse and repeat and rinse and repeat. So yeah, like crappy jobs affect all of our psyches, right?
Yeah,
they really do. And we just definitely don't want anyone to be forced into sex industries in particular, because of poverty, because they will compromise themselves and people will take advantage of them.
Yeah.
And that's what we want to end.
That's what we want to end. Yeah. And that's what your charity is about, isn't it? Numb.
Yeah, National Ugly Month, definitely. It's about that. It's about, first of all, providing victim support to sex workers and people who are harmed in the adult industries, making sure that they are validated and heard and get the quality victim support. Yeah. Then we process those reports of harm into alerts, so that we send warnings to sex working communities to avoid this person or this condition or whatever. And we facilitate people who choose to engage in police and courts to seek justice. But we definitely support people to healing and recovery, and also developing resilience. So we have a number of programs that we're doing now, working on now, to make sure that like harm to sex worker doesn't go invisibilized, and that we make sure that the policies and our public services and our police services respond and really support and prevent violence against sex workers. And we do that. The media has a role to play as well, because the language, the derogatory terms, prostitute, whore, hooker, all of these things that are, the language, we dehumanize sex workers such that those bastards that are sick enough to target people for harm will choose people who they perceive that we don't give a shit about. Right? And a lot of times that's why sex workers are targeted for harm. And we have cases, and we see cases the world over, where sex workers are victimized by an individual and then nothing's done about it. Cases get thrown out, NFA, all of this stuff. And then they go on to harm other folks and murder and rape other folks. And then usually if they get caught because they've harmed someone who's not a sex worker.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we're talking on the day that Bill Cosby was just released from jail.
Yeah, yesterday, right?
Yep. So it's very hard to, especially against someone so powerful, but even that, it's hard to, the public have been manipulated so that their sympathies lie elsewhere, because we've stigmatized these people. But you've been in the industry for, did you say 27 years? Do you think the broad changes over time are swinging towards a less stigma, more positive legislation for the workers, or are you pessimistic about it?
Yeah, I there's glimmers of hope, but then there's a lot of setbacks. Like I think that compared to how things were in the 90s, like sex workers are those who can be are out, they're organizing, they're unionizing, they're claiming their space, but they do that at incredible expense to themselves and their movements, but they're absolutely advocating for their rights. And I will always be here to support in however I can to amplify those voices. I think some progressive politicians get the idea that increasing criminalizing, increasing police involvement in people's lives is not a way to address survival sex or sex work, because we're not dealing with some of the social issues. We're not dealing with poverty and homelessness and, you know, mental health and trauma and you know, victimized. Like we're not dealing with some of the reasons that motivate involvement in sex industries and in other forms of survival crime and survival work or whatever. But sex work's not illegal, but informal work and survival crime. We're not dealing with we're just not dealing with human beings holistically, with, you know, quality of work, quality of life, food security, housing security, family breakdown, you know, childhood exploitation, child abuse. Like, so we have a lot of folks who are wounded and hurt and medicating and coping and just trying to drag their asses to work every day. And we have a really sick society and a sick community in a lot of ways, but that is the type of society that our brand of capitalism needs. So I think that we, you know, there needs to be a sea change. I think that there is some progressive work going on, decriminalization in New Zealand, decriminalization in New South Wales, decriminalization in Victoria potentially, and there are some forward movements around recognizing harm reduction and recognizing some of the, if we don't deal with some of the underlying social inequities and economic insecurity, that, you know, criminalizing is, what's that going to do? That's just going to, the sex industry is going to continue no matter what policies are in place. Because think about places where there's full criminalization, the US, right? Aside from some bunny ranches, etc. Full criminalization. You think sex industry work ended? No. Like porn ended, webcam ended. No, there's just,
in my doing research for this book, I looked up where is porn the most downloaded and consumed in the world, and it's in Saudi Arabia, where there's so much repression of basic bodily rights, especially for women. And it's like, well, of course, then you know, that the desire doesn't go somewhere. It gets channeled somewhere else.
And then people need an outlet. Like that's the thing. It will pop up. Life finds a way, you know. Life, sex work will find. I'm like quoting like what
Jurassic Park.
Oh God. Yeah. But it is true. It's like either we decide that sex is part of society, part of human, you know, it's part of who we are.
Well, there wouldn't be human beings without it.
Well, there you go. And like consuming adult content for consenting adults should be okay.
Yeah.
You watching porn, me watching porn, anyone who wants to do, you know, you want to order a massage from someone who's like, who's paid well, who, you know, like you might want to do that. Like, and some people want the freedom and liberty to do that. So unless we're going to be full on repressive society, then we'll make everything illegal, you know, everything from strippers to everything, right? Shut everything up, which I don't think that's where we're going, but it almost seems like, what's the end game for folks who want to criminalize adult industries? Like what, I don't know what their utopia is, but they haven't dealt with poverty, and they haven't dealt with just the fact that people have the right to freely express themselves the way they bloody want to in terms of, you know, sexuality, and that's just part of who we are as animals.
And that's something that we're seeing a lot of in the modern digital age. Like sex work has obviously been fundamentally changed by the internet in so many ways. John Ronson has this really interesting audio series about sort of how Pornhub became this behemoth and sort of sucked up all of the money from the industry in like one change. And that's like on a big systemic scale, quite an interesting story, but also down to the individual sole trader. There are so many places where you can use an internet as a middleman, and in that way, like you said, become an entrepreneur, become almost a brand, become
there's a lot of
business
people who absolutely, and
in ways
there's a
that
lot of
couldn't exist
people before. And so yeah, the internet has facilitated some industry work, but then some industry work is just completely based on internet. If we didn't have internet, we wouldn't have these certain industries that are emerging. So yeah, like adult content creators, they produce all kinds of things, they sell the reruns, they sell whatever, the money shots or whatever, and they're able to have their own websites and do their thing. And so like there's quite a broad spectrum of sex industry. So that's the issue with if people are looking at really narrow populations or narrow bands, and trying to enact policy that would affect larger populations within, I don't think that they see the full scope of the sex industry and how the internet facilitates this non-contact sex work and porn and interaction and webcam. A friend of mine wrote a book actually that I'm halfway through, and it's called Camming: Money, Power, and Pleasure in the Sex Industry. Her name's Angela Jones. And so she does a complete expose of, webcamming, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And that's definitely a form of industry work that wasn't available. But, before that, what did we have? We had the phone sex. And I think there was a couple of comedies that had like some guy pretending he's a woman and talking on, hi, baby, or whatever. Like, we had ways of doing these things.
It's always been around. I remember when I was a kid, there was this thing, I don't think they really do it so much anymore, but it was like a British seaside tradition. They'd have like naughty postcards. And when you're sort of like cards. 10, and it's kind of like at the beach with like ice cream cones covering kind of thing, and you've got a 10-year-old brain and you're like, what is this? There's always been some way for it to, but it seems like, and I wonder what your opinion on this, because when the pandemic hit, we suddenly saw quite a lot of people with higher profile, let's say, joining sites like OnlyFans, which is part of, people making millions who are bona fide celebrities, and it's private access. It's not necessarily sexual, but it's obviously also very related to sex work. So you don't have to put sexual photos on there, but a lot of people use it for that point. And some of the celebrities who signed up have done that. And do you think that, in terms of the broader culture and the way that we look at these things, do you think that will systematically or in any way alter people's opinions, or do you think it's just a flash in the pan, it's just a moment?
Well, it's one of those things, right? The more mainstream something gets, the more accessible more acceptable it becomes. It is that politics of respectability that happens. Do you remember when pole dancing, all the soccer moms and I don't know, all the moms were all started to do pole dancing as exercise, right? So, there is that, I think that there are elements, burlesque, for example, like there are elements of adult industries that have been mainstreamed and will always be mainstreamed. And I think that, that will always happen. But then within this hierarchy again, there will be those things that are going to be seen as more tainted, more dirty, more unacceptable. So I don't know if we're going to put our arms around the full sex industry ever. Like,
that might
but
be,
you see forms of BDSM, you see that kind of thing when you get these mainstream, what was it? 50 Shades of something, 50 Shades of Grey, so there is some of that mainstreaming, but I think that'll continue, but definitely I don't think we're going to embrace the industry in its entirety. We're going to be, mainstream folks are going to be quite selective, and they're going to whitewash and sanitize whatever it is they co-opt from the industry, just like the pole dancing. Because I think the best pole dancing instructors will be actual strippers, right? But instead you've got this you got a girl in the leggings and she's like, whatever, to each his own. But it's just, it's like when anything else is co-opted, right? Like you get this bastardized version. And then sometimes it even erases its ties to adult industries, right? Like, so it becomes this exercise, jazzercise, whatever, but it doesn't say, well, actually strippers are making money with this move in particular or whatever. And maybe people want to be titillated by that, or want to be engage in that in a way that's safe and contained, so that their worth and value isn't tainted by engaging in it. Like, so I think, yeah, people will put boxes around things and make them quite consumable and quite sanitized.
Yeah. So yeah, even if there's sort of legislation the next day which changes the reality, people's attitudes don't just suddenly change with the stroke of a pen, do they? That's
no, and that's why stigma persists.
Yeah, but I think I sense that you're saying you think that culture is broadly moving towards, you don't know how long this arc might be, but broadly moving towards less stigma, more acceptance, more power to the worker. It's a long,
because it's a long
haul.
It's a long journey.
Yeah,
I don't know if it'll happen in my lifetime, but we see that with just in certain, there's always going to be some holdouts, right? But we see, like with most millennials and most folks, like we're understanding gender diversity, we're understanding like acceptance of race and culture. We're like, I think like young girls are growing up wanting to be an influencer. Like our societies are moving along, so there will be really conservative pockets. And most of those folks are usually the ones that are policymakers or politicians, etc. But we, as the generations move on and we start to elect representatives that truly reflect our values and etc., I think that there'll be some small incremental changes. But what I want to see is some more immediate changes to legislation and to responses to how sex workers are victimized that we can do immediately. We don't need a whole generation to change, because people's lives are at stake if we're not sending those messages that sex workers are part of our communities, that they are just like us, that if you hurt them, you hurt us, come one, come all, and we're going to protect them, and we're going to make sure that the people who think that they can target them with impunity get the full force of the law and social protection as well. Like they get the full force of social censure as well. Because if we're going to say that we're a society that stands against victimization and stands against abuse, we have to do that for everyone, whether we think that they're ideal victims or not, whether we think that they have clean hands or not. That
ideal victim,
everyone,
very interesting term. Yeah,
because sex workers don't need that. I probably don't need that. I'm a Black woman. I don't have access to like discourses of white female fragility, for example. I have to negotiate my innocence. I have to, outside of my workplace, I'm the CEO, so I have a lot of power within my workplace. I have a PhD, so I have a lot of power and influence in academics. But just walking down the street, my life is different. Like my CV is not stapled to my forehead.
More's the pity.
So it's like, and even if it was, maybe they'll beat me more. Who knows? But it is that thing. Like I think we're moving towards making a safer, better world for everyone.
Yeah.
And I think that there's a lot of us who are interested in that. And also want to end trafficking and end rape and abuse and all these other things. But we have to. We're smart enough to recognize and to have respect for how people define and understand their own situation. So that whole call in the book around including sex workers, hearing from sex workers, we have to respect how other adults define their work and lives, the same way I would respect how you define and conceptualize your work, and you would respect how I do it. If we're seen as adults on equal footing, and we respect each other, then we would make sure that we're working in each other's interests. But if you see a population as beneath you, as criminal, as whatever, their lives don't matter, then we oppress them. And there's no reason to do that for people in sex industries.
No, and we need to stop doing that. It's just one of humankind's sort of least attractive aspects, and we need to all be aware of it and keep working on it. And I mean, you've been very generous with your time, Dr. Bowen. What can people do other than buy your book, Work, Money and Duality, Trading Sex as a Side Hustle? How can people help?
Sure. And I think doing what you've done, like even in preparation for the interview, you've read, you've, picked up on some new terminology, you've applied it to how you understand the world. Like I think the more educated we become with how the rights of other populations that we live alongside are being affected, I think that's better, and that will make us stronger. Also keep an eye out for when sex workers are calling out for support, when they're seeing that they're being violated, when they want changes in law, when they want reviews of certain pieces of the legislation. Read about it, get educated, and then join the chorus, right? Obviously I have to plug my charity, that there's a lot of our charities that are working to support victims and to create options and improve the lives of people who we serve. So donate to charities that are working in this area. Absolutely. But it is that, and then interpersonally, it's when you see the sex worker, when you hear a sex worker a joke, you just don't participate. You just call that out. Same way we would call out race jokes or gay jokes or whatever. It's like, call out those jokes that that we stop that violence that happens in interaction with each other. I think that's an important
casual dismissal
step.
that is kept hidden by those jokes that actually have some sort of malicious intent underneath. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Just before you go, because I know you have a thing for where does the name for the charity come from?
National Ugly Mugs.
What's the story? Because it's nationaluglymugs.org. That's where people should go to learn more. What's the story behind the name?
Yeah, the name, this Ugly Mugs is like, a mug is somebody who's unsavory, etc.
Yeah.
And so sex workers in Australia had ugly mugs lists, like of bad clients or dangerous people. Stay away from. He's an effing mug, like stay away from him, whatever. Yeah. And then that's also part of British culture as well. And so they were, they were like these like dodgy punter schemes and ugly mug schemes that were all over the country, peppered throughout. And so National Ugly Mugs came to centralize a lot of those because they weren't talking to each other in ways that they should have been. So someone who victimized a sex worker, and that way the ugly mugs warnings get out to more broadly. But yeah, it is that thing that is sort of just a dodgy punter kind of idea, tongue-in-cheek. I wanted the names changed, to be honest, but there's such history, and some people like the name, some people don't, but it is one of those talking points, right? But yeah, an ugly mug is someone who victimizes
Listen, I think I, as much as I could sympathize with why you might want the name change, like from like I don't know, a branding point of view, or just like, do we want people to in a way,
it has history.
In a way, it's the perfect name, because actually at the crux of, I think, of a lot of what we've been talking about is that we want to get rid of these people who view sex workers as a disposable, as these bad punters, these ugly mugs. They are a problem. They need to be known. They need to be criminalized. They need to be stopped. And survival sex has to end. And those two things are feeding each other. So more information sharing can only be a good thing, especially when it's protecting people who are often vulnerable. Anyway, listen to me.
Anyway,
I don't know.
No, that's really good. No,
you're the scientist.
I know, but all of us can become experts in these kinds of things, and it's really important. I think that going forward, some of the things that snagged in the book for you and that popped in the book for you will come up again when we're talking about labor market and all kinds of things that you'll see that it is all integrated. We are all one. But I really appreciate you having me on, and looking forward to seeing what your audience might think of the book.
Absolutely. Well, Raymond, if I may, it's been a pleasure to get to know you, and have a blessed Canada Day.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.